Hey everybody. Hello. We're going to talk about mental illness today. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not an expert on mental illness, but then again, most psychiatrists aren't experts either. So we're going to wait for 30 seconds. Hi, Mary. Hi, Vincent. Hi, everybody. All right, we'll just jump into it. I am extremely uncomfortable with the demonization that happens towards the mentally ill in this country. The mentally ill have become sort of our national scapegoats for everything that goes wrong. And especially when we're talking about the worst kinds of things like mass shootings and everything else, that's what everyone says. Well, it's mental illness. The mentally ill people, they're the ones doing all this. And it's been said over and over again that we need to take guns away from mentally ill people. Like someone who says this, they think that they've just thought of they've just solved a problem. They say, oh, I know what we need to do. Take guns away from mentally ill people. It's as simple as that. Just go find all the mentally ill people and tell them and inform them that their Second Amendment rights are done because they're mentally ill. Now, as infamously now, President Trump proposed this very idea yesterday. He made this suggestion in a meeting. He explained that we could take the guns away from mentally ill people, and then afterwards we can give them due process. So due process after is what he said. Of course, giving someone due process after you've already deprived them of their property and their liberty it kind of defeats the purpose. At that point, there's something very Orwellian, very Soviet about this idea of due process after. It kind of reminds me of Animal Farm. All animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So it's kind of the same thing where we're saying, sure, you can have due process. We're just kind of adjusting the process a little bit. That's all. It's a process adjustment. And in this due process adjustment, what happens is you don't have due process. But President Trump is expressing a pretty common and popular view. And from what anecdotally, from what I saw yesterday when I talked about this on Facebook, his proposal found a fair amount of support among supposed conservatives. Now, it goes without saying, of course, that if Barack Obama, can you imagine if Barack Obama had ever actually said, like, these are his explicit words, let's take their guns and then we can do due process after. Can you imagine if President Obama had ever said that? Okay? We spent 8 years accusing Obama of wanting to take our guns and take our due process rights, which I think he did want that, but he never said it. Trump came out and said it, like, let's actually do it. And if Barack Obama had ever said that, every conservative in the country would have just exploded. It would have been a volcano. We would have had molten lava coming out of our heads. That's the kind of explosion that would have happened if Obama ever said that. Trump says it, and yeah, he endures a fair amount of criticism, but there also were a fair amount of conservatives who said, oh, well, maybe, sure. Actually, yeah, maybe we could do that. And this is a totally different topic. I don't want to get off on this topic, but this is why I hate partisanship so much. Now, I believe in standing on principles and standing for your ideas. That's not partisanship, okay? I'm not one of these, let's come together and find common ground. I'm one of the people saying there's very little common ground in American culture, and I'm not going to find common ground by giving up steadfast principles. Partisanship, on the other hand, is I'm going to stick with my guy. I'm going to stick with my party no matter what they say. And I'm going to forget about principles. I'm just going to follow them around. Wherever they go, I'm following them. And there are some people who do that with Trump. And literally, no matter what he says, they will completely abandon their point of view, their principles, everything they believed in for 50 years, they will throw overboard if Trump says it. And it's not the majority, but there are some in that camp, and it is pathetic, awful, disgusting, gross. I'm running out of words to describe it. Anyway, there's a certain, if you don't think too deeply about it, there's a certain logic, I guess, to this idea of let's take guns from mentally ill people, because the idea is, well, we can't have mentally ill people running around with guns, can we? So let's take their guns. No, let's not. Let's not take their guns, and let me explain why. Number one, being mentally ill is not a crime. You know what is a crime? Threatening to shoot people. So the Parkland killer, he threatened to shoot people. According to the reports, he was, not only did he threaten to shoot people, he was a violent person. He violently assaulted people. There was a case, I believe, I read that he put a gun to somebody's head. He talked about wanting to kill people. Now, that is a crime. So the reason why we blame law enforcement local law enforcement for not stopping this guy, it isn't because, well, he was mentally ill and they didn't take his guns. It's because he said he wanted to kill people, and he was saying this around, and then people would call the cops and say, look, we got this guy who's violent, he's threatening violence. Can you come investigate and do something? And they didn't do anything. So if somebody, forget about mental, it doesn't matter if they're lucid, it doesn't matter if they're a lunatic. That doesn't matter. If somebody threatens to kill people, that's a crime. So you can investigate and you can put somebody in jail for that and take their guns. So that's fine. That I totally am on board for that. But if the Parkland killer had just been a little bit weird and a little bit off and, eccentric and whatever else, but he had never threatened violence and he had never acted violently, then guess what? You can't take his guns. You have no basis upon which to deprive him of liberty. He didn't do anything in that case. You can't just come, this is a basic fact of constitutional law. You can't just come in with no reason whatsoever. You don't have probable cause. There's no crime's been committed. You don't even suspect that a crime might be committed. And yet you come in and just take their property. You can't do that. We live in America. This is not exaggeration. That is literally what the Soviets did. That is communist stuff. That's what communists do. We don't do that. But it's irrelevant anyway. Because the Parkland guy, as far as I know, he's never even been diagnosed with a mental illness. The problem is that he was violent. I don't care what mental illnesses he had. He was a violent person, and that is criminal, and so you could have taken his guns for that reason, and they didn't. If somebody has such a mental problem that they're in a mental health institution, they have to be institutionalized, well then obviously, at least temporarily, you're taking their guns, because they're not going to take their guns with them into a mental health institution. But if somebody's mentally ill and they're living and they're living on their own and they're functioning as normal people in society, you can't deprive them of their property. You can't punish them for having a sickness, having an illness. You can't do that. And by the way, if we're saying that all mentally ill people, shouldn't have guns, and I guess the reason for that is we're saying, well, then mentally ill people, all of them, they're all suspected mass killers or would-be mass killers, and so if they take their guns, well, then why are we stopping at taking their guns? I mean, if all of them could any minute just go off the rails and start shooting, then I don't want them around my kids. I don't want them around my family. They shouldn't be, they shouldn't have jobs where they're working with people. There should be, I guess, a registry, like a sex offender registry, and they should all be registered. And so we can, and if they move into the neighborhood, they have to come and tell us because they're all dangerous, right? and they can't live within 100 feet of a school. I mean, if that's what you're telling me, if somebody who is not a criminal yet is so sick that we can't trust them with a gun, because if they have a gun, they might very probably end up killing a lot of people, well, then that's someone who just should not be in society at all. So how far are we taking this is my question. Once you have gone to the point of saying we're going to take their guns, well, then the question is, why are you taking their guns? And you're telling me it's because, well, they might end up being mass killers. Well, if that's the case, then we should do a lot more than take their guns, shouldn't we? It's illogical. It's an illogical, stupid, dumb, ridiculous, childish, shallow, hollow solution. Number 2. Everyone is mentally ill. Did you know that? Welcome to the year 2018. Welcome to the last 30 or 40 years of American society. Everybody is mentally ill. Okay? Everyone. So you want to take guns away from mentally ill people? Hand yours over first. Because guess what? You're mentally ill. There are literally hundreds of mental illnesses listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that psychiatrists use. And any psychiatrist worth his salt that knows his stuff and studied, if you go to him, he could find 5 or 6 mental illnesses for you. He could find them in 30 minutes, no problem. There are so many to choose from. So are you feeling depressed? Well, hand over your guns. Feeling anxious? Hand over your guns. Are you easily distracted? Hand over your guns. Do you have mood swings? Well, there go your guns. On and on and on. And forget about, by the way, combat veterans, they all lose their guns, pretty much, because many of them struggle with PTSD, and considering what they've been through, if they sit down with a psychiatrist could easily diagnose them with a dozen different things, which doesn't mean they actually are mentally ill. That's my point. I'll get to that in a minute. It just means that they've had experiences that are traumatic, and it affects them. And so I guess we're taking guns away from all the veterans, too, while we're at it. So just if you support this proposal, just realize that's what you're doing. Mental illnesses are extremely subjective. The diagnosis for them is extremely imprecise. And it's also political. The psychiatry industry decided recently that men who think they're women, men who are actually delusional, and who walk around in dresses, and who go to it and who have their genitals sliced and diced to make it look like female genitals, the psychiatrists are telling us those guys aren't mentally ill. So if you're sad or anxious or easily distracted or traumatized from your experiences overseas in war, you're mentally ill. But the guy who's walking around in a dress with fake breasts and who is literally delusional, that guy's not mentally ill, according to psychiatrists. Do you want to know why? Because mental illness is political. It's long since been political. Let me just give you a little idea of how mental health conditions are diagnosed, okay? Just so you understand how a mental health condition is diagnosed, and just so you understand why everyone in the world has a mental health condition. So let me give you a few examples. So according to WebMD, ADHD is a mental health condition. And a great many of our children have been diagnosed with it, especially boys. That's interesting, isn't it? The vast majority of kids who are diagnosed ADHD are boys. So what do you tell? So apparently boyhood itself is an illness, okay? Or is there some kind of mysterious thing that makes boys more susceptible to this mysterious mental illness that no one can really define? And certainly no one can locate it in the brain. I don't care what anyone's told you. If you look at a brain, you cannot find ADHD in the brain by looking at it. You can't, period. Nobody can. You can say, well, there's chemicals. So, of course, no matter what emotion or experience or whatever's going on in your head, whatever your emotion is, whatever your state of mind, there are chemical reactions to it that can be observed. But that doesn't mean that it's an illness. And you also don't know if it's a chicken or egg. In other words, are the chemical reactions happening because you feel that way? Or do you feel that way because the chemical reactions are happening? Guess what? No one can answer that question. Nobody can answer that question. Because we're dealing with the human mind. The human mind is not a physical thing. The brain is physical, the human mind is not. The human mind is a transcendent, really a spiritual concept that psychiatrists don't understand because they're trying to make it physical and material, and it isn't. So anyway, ADHD. Here are the symptoms of ADHD according to WebMD. Just a few of them. I mean, there are dozens of symptoms, but this is for kids. Easily distracted, miss details, forget things, frequently switch from one activity to another, have difficulty focusing, become bored easily, have difficulty focusing attention on organizing things, have trouble completing homework, seems not to listen when spoken to, daydreams, struggles to follow instructions. So basically a child. Basically, what you've described is every child who has ever existed on the face of planet Earth. I mean, this is what we're dealing with. They have daydreaming. They have listed daydreaming as a symptom of an illness. That's what we're talking about here. Sometimes I feel like I'm crazy because it seems like, why doesn't anyone else have a problem with this? I know some people do, but why do we just accept this? I mean, this is crazy. Speaking of crazy, that's crazy what I just read. Daydreaming is a symptom of an illness in a child? What? How could anyone accept that? I feel like I'm living in a dystopian novel. I feel like this isn't even, I guess I am mentally ill, because I feel like this cannot be, this can't be reality. We can't actually be living in a world like this, can we? Here's how depression is described by psychiatry.org. Depression is a mental illness, okay? Here are some of the symptoms. Feeling sad. Loss of interest or pleasure in activities you once enjoyed. Changes in appetite, trouble sleeping, loss of energy, increase in purposelessness. So you're feeling like you have no purpose. Feeling worthless, feeling guilty, difficulty thinking or concentrating, thoughts of death. Okay, I want you to find me one person on earth. I want you to go find me one person on earth who by this definition has never been depressed. Find me one. It is my opinion that according to the modern definition of mental illness, everyone in the world is mentally ill. And let's start with this. Find me one person who has never had loss of interest, has never felt worthless, has never felt guilty, has never felt sad for a sustained amount of time. Can you find me one person? You can't. So we can just start there. I mean, we all lose our guns already because we could all fall into that category, at least at some point in our lives. And look, I know that somebody will say, well, depression depression isn't just sadness, it's misery, it's despondency, it's despair. Okay, great. But can you come up with an absolute, objective, and observable distinction between sadness and despair? Can you? I mean, and can you observe it in the brain? Can a neurologist look at somebody's brain and tell me whether they are sad or whether they are in despair based on observing the brain? Find me the despair function of the brain, can you? And are you telling me despair is really an illness? In other words, nobody is ever supposed to feel despair. There could never be a reason to feel despair. Here's the thing. Up until recently, despair, sorrow, pain, all these things, these were topics that these were topics for philosophers. Soren Kierkegaard wrote a whole book on the topic of despair in the 19th century. And he was a philosopher. He was a Christian philosopher. He was an existentialist. So up until the 20th century, something like despair was considered a spiritual, philosophical question, and we would try to plunge into its depths and understand it. And what is it? Where does it come from? But it was basically accepted by everyone that at its root, it is a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual problem. It's a spiritual experience. But then in the 20th century rolls around, and we have reduced everything to the brain, and we've decided that, actually, let's throw away thousands of years of philosophy and thousands of years of spiritual insight. Let's toss all that to the side, because all of this is actually just an illness. It's actually just a sickness, and if you give somebody a drug, they'll stop feeling it. Kierkegaard, by the way, would have defined despair as he would have defined it as an imbalancement, but not an imbalancement of chemicals in your brain. It was a moral, spiritual imbalancement. It was when a person was essentially out of tune with God, out of tune with natural law. And I don't want to get a whole thing about Kierkegaard, but what Kierkegaard believed was that that life, human existence, is constantly, it's a tension between two kind of extremes, two opposites. So, for instance, human life is a tension between the infinite and the finite. The infinite on one hand, we have sort of one foot in infinity, in eternity, because we're spiritual beings. We also have one foot in our physical existence. Now, he would have said that somebody who is in despair is somebody who has despaired of one aspect, one part of that equation. So, a materialist who rejects the infinite, rejects the eternal, and thinks that we live only in a material world, that is someone who is in despair, because he has despaired of the infinite. All right, we'll just put that aside. Look, I'm not a philosopher any more than I'm a psychiatrist. I can tell you that's what Kierkegaard thought. And I think there's something to that. Someone who has given up on the infinite, someone who has given up on the eternal, someone who has given up on God is in despair. That's not a physical sickness. You can't drug somebody into believing in God. You can't drug someone into having into receiving grace. You can't drug someone into seeing a purpose in life. Can you? Misery and despair are spiritual conditions. They are not psychological ones. The psychiatry industry has medicalized every human emotion, every human inclination, every temptation, every fault, every quirk. It has all been medicalized, categorized, cataloged, labeled. You slap a label on it, you put it in their little mental illness Bible, and that's what they've done. So the powers that be, and this is where I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theory. This is where I'm going to sound crazy. But the powers that be have been trying for decades to essentially prove that every human being on the planet is mentally ill. And now the powers that be want to use mental illness to deprive us of our rights. Gee, I mean, it seems almost like there's a connection. It seems almost like there's a plan here, right? Or, like I said, maybe I'm crazy, but it seems almost like we've been spending 30 years creating all these mental illnesses and encompassing everyone under this gigantic blanket of mental illness, and now we're getting to the point where we're saying, oh, by the way, everyone under that blanket, you don't have rights. Seems like there might be, I don't know, a connection between the two things. Like there's a little bit of a plan here. I don't know. We're already told. Now, this is according to the psychiatry industry. The psychiatry industry will tell us that 20%, 1 in 5 Americans are mentally ill. That's what right now. So think about that. 20% of Americans have a mental illness, according to them. That's 60 million. So already, so that's 60 million people already. The Bill of Rights is thrown out for them. They're exempt from the Bill of Rights. That's 60 million out the window immediately. What about the other 80%? What about the other 4? The other 4 out of 5? Well, the only reason why they haven't been diagnosed with a mental illness is because they haven't gone to a psychiatrist yet. But if we were, for instance, depriving Second Amendment rights from the mentally ill, then all the government has to do is instruct you to go to a court-appointed shrink, and that shrink will have no problem at all pinning at least a couple of conditions on you. And how are you going to prove otherwise? You're crazy, right? So once they've done that, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no due process, remember, especially for a crazy person like you. So that's it. That's my case. And there's a greater, more important, a deeper conversation to be had here, getting away from gun rights. And I've only scratched the surface of it, but there's a bigger conversation here about just mental illness itself and our approach to medicalizing human suffering and medicalizing things like guilt and despair. We could talk for another 2 hours about that, because I'm going to tell you that, and it's fine if you're a materialist and you're an atheist, then I guess basically, yeah, you have to believe that all of these things are mental illnesses. But if you're a Christian or you're Jewish, or if you're religious at all, any religion, if you're not an atheist, if you're religious to any extent, then you have to realize. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as a brain disease, or there really are people out there who are delusional, schizophrenic. I mean, that does exist, but something like guilt, that's from God. Guilt is something that's a spiritual event going on inside you. And it's up to you. Now, you could discern if it's guilt, if it is deserved guilt, if it's guilt that you're feeling because you did something wrong, well, then that's God who's putting that on your heart and calling you to repentance. If it's undeserved guilt, if you're walking around feeling worthless and like you hate yourself and you're guilty and you haven't done anything to warrant that, it's still not mental illness. It's a spiritual phenomenon, but it's coming from the other direction. Okay, these are darker forces that are injecting, that are guiding you in that direction. It's really, you kind of have to accept that as the case if you believe that these spiritual forces exist. And it just strikes me that so many Christians have accepted this completely materialist view of the human condition, where everything that happens inside you, especially all the difficult things, all the hard things, all the painful things, all of that has to do with your physical brain. That is a materialist, atheist, anti-God perspective that you should not adopt or promote if you are not anti-God and materialist. All right. We will leave it there. Thanks for participating in the discussion, everyone. I'll talk to you next time.